Brussels has so much potential as a cosmopolitan democracy, but how are international voters going to transform Brussels? Before we get on to what specifically you can do as an international voter and what we can do as the international community, we need to understand how Brussels democracy can work for everyone. And that also means getting some key information and some key inspiration. I'm going to be giving you 4 key arguments that you can use with your fellow international voters, but also to make your own strategies to become a real activist and change the city. So, how are we going to make Brussels democracy work? Well, first, let's take a step back and see the challenge ahead of us. In Belgium, we have some of the highest voter turnout rates in general in the world. This is the land of voting. But here in Brussels, in the democratic world's most cosmopolitan city, we are actually headed for a democratic deficit. Have a look at the statistics for your commune for the 2018 local elections, and you'll see that actually maybe the majority of potential voters didn't vote in the local elections. And this trend is likely to get worse and worse over the next coming local elections. For example, in Etterbeek, Ixelles, Saint-Gilles, Saint-Josse, you barely have a majority of people voting in the local elections. Now, part of that is because people abstain. About 17% of the Brussels electorate don't end up voting in local elections. But the big challenge with the Brussels democratic deficit is international voter outreach. Now, why is that a challenge? Why do we have this deficit? Well, it's because the number of seats in the city council and aldermen is based on the overall population. So have a look at the numbers in your commune for the number of city councilors and aldermen that you get based on the size of the overall population. But the number of votes that you need as a politician to get elected to the city council, it depends on the size of the electorate. So if only Belgian citizens are voting, then it's much easier for politicians to get elected as a city councilor. Now, this means that we have to do a lot more work for outreach to international voters. Voter registration is required for international voters in Belgium, but it's not part of the political culture in Belgium because Belgian citizens have been automatically registered to vote as part of obligatory voting since 1893. Voter registration has not been part of Belgian political culture for over 100 years. And for the moment, international voters have to face one of the earliest registration deadlines in the EU. They have to register as an international voter 90 days before the local election. They have to be better informed about local politics than your most active Belgian citizen. And it's very hard to reach a lot of international voters here in Belgium. They don't have a lot of contact with the government or with nonprofits because they come here as workers or as students, especially mobile EU citizens. They don't use a lot of these services, so it's hard to get them the information on the voter registration. It's also a complicated process for the communes to take up a role here to inform people because there's so much high mobility for international voters. People are constantly coming in, coming out, and Belgium does have some complicated residence requirements, so there's often a lot of administrative burden on internationals and on the communes to register people as residents. Communes also have to run the elections, which is a huge amount of work in a country with obligatory voting. So they often don't have a lot of time or resources to reach out to international voters. And unfortunately, there's no clear government responsibility in Belgium for leading voter outreach. The federal, regional, and local authorities don't take up a proactive role for voter registration. Countries that have extensive voter registration also have a lot of research on what it takes to reach people. So you normally need to spend around 30 euros on the most effective outreach methods to convince one person to sign up to vote. And unfortunately, here in the Brussels region, we're going to have to sign up 300,000 voters. With the funds that we have, we can maybe reach around 5,000 people. We're only having about 1% of the spending that we need for a healthy Brussels democracy. And that's partly because politicians traditionally have looked at international voting with a lot of skepticism, xenophobia, and politicization. They don't know these international voters. They have a lot of assumptions and myths about different nationalities, and they politicize this process. They only want to register internationals who are going to vote for their specific parties. And in fact, if you're an incumbent politician, you might not be particularly interested in increasing the electorate because then you're going to need more votes to get elected for the city council. And you might be happy with the votes and the voters that you already have. So often parties shift the responsibility for inclusive democracy onto individual candidates of diverse backgrounds, like EU citizens, and make them go out on their own and get their own voters. But all of this leads to a lot of misinformation that circulates among the international community, a lot of myths, because we don't have the multilingual resources coming from government. And that creates a lot of challenges for international voters. Here is a survey from the Brussels Commissioner from Europe that asked internationals why they didn't vote in the local elections. And what you can see is only 20% said they weren't interested in local voting. So the vast majority of international voters are interested in local politics. But as you can see, most international voters have not yet signed up to vote because they have not received all the right info on time on how to sign up and also why their vote matters. They don't know how voting works, what is obligatory voting, what is the registration process, what are the deadlines, what do you do if you're not around on election day, what are the requirements, what are the powers of our communes, and who are the parties that we can vote for, and a bunch of other myths that are circulating. So we have to take up these challenges for international voters and for Belgian democracy. How are we going to do that? Well, we can make Brussels democracy work by knowing our powers. And we already talked about why Brussels has so much potential as a cosmopolitan democracy. We have more powers here in Belgium at the local level than in any other country. And we have so many political choices, from national parties to local parties to EU citizen candidates. But here are four other key arguments. We need to know our history, our numbers, our priorities, and our contributions. So first, knowing our history. Well, Belgium was one of the first countries in Europe to have a liberal constitution with voting rights after 250 years of struggle for independence. But that only enfranchised the richest 1% of people who could vote. So it took decades for Belgium to adopt obligatory voting, the first country in the world to have obligatory voting, and that was meant to stop voter intimidation. Voters were being stopped from going to the polls by their employer, by thugs, by the police. And so obligatory voting enshrined the right that everyone has to go to the polls and to choose their representatives. Belgium was also the first country in Europe to introduce proportional representation, which is called the De Hond system, that we use for proportional representation around the world. The working class still had to fight through World War I to get an equal vote, so one man, one vote. This only enfranchised men to vote, but Belgium's initial progress on obligatory voting and proportional representation did develop the Belgian welfare state that has guaranteed us one of the countries with the lowest levels of economic inequality in the wealthy world. But there's been a trade-off. Belgium was a country where very quickly obligatory voting and proportional representation created an inclusive electorate, but also a very stable electorate where politicians were then skeptical about opening voting rights to everyone in society. So it might surprise you to learn that Belgium was one of the last countries in Europe to grant equal voting rights to women, to colonized people, to naturalized citizens, to young people aged 18 to 21. In fact, it was also one of the last countries to grant local voting rights to EU citizens after they had to go to court at the European Court of Justice to push forward this reform. And eventually, Belgium opened up these local voting rights to non-EU citizens, but the national government was threatened by extending voting rights. What's important to remember is that Belgians and non-Belgians have fought for decades for you to have the right to vote as a working person, a woman, people from all around the world, young people. And it's only by using our voting rights that we have been able to create a country where we have such progress on the welfare state, gender equality, equal citizenship, representation of young people, integration, and diversity. Remember, voting is your fundamental right. The European Charter of Fundamental Rights has guaranteed that EU citizens have the right to vote and stand as candidates in local elections, and Belgium has extended that also to non-EU citizens. So if this is our history, what's our place in history? Who is going to be making history in these local elections? Do you recognize this man? In many ways, he is the image of a Brussels that has passed. This is Roger Knowles, who was the mayor of Schaerbeek. And in the 1980s, he was so opposed at the idea of granting voting rights to non-Belgian citizens that he got on a camel and said, this is what's going to happen to Brussels if immigrants end up participating in local politics. Luckily, Roger Knowles was wrong, but it might surprise you to realize that Brussels suffered from such closed politicians and such racist discourse, because many of us arrived with a Brussels that has been so welcoming, so dynamic, so inclusive. But that's because so many people have fought to give you the opportunity to participate. So how will you be making history as the international community? In fact, the international community has been transforming Brussels, not just its economy, its cosmopolitan culture, its status as the capital of Europe, but also its politics. So you might see that photo from the 1960s and recognize that space. It's the Grand Place, which in the 1960s was a parking lot. And it was thanks to mobilization by the international community through the Bulletin, the main English-speaking magazine, that a sit-in was organized in 1971 to ask for this UNESCO World Heritage Site to be given back to Brussels residents. And that mobilization of the international community gave the Grand Place back to Brussels residents, the most beautiful square in Europe. This action inspired activists in 2012, who then organized a sit-in picnic on the Boulevard Anspach, and that inspired the Brussels city and region to come together to create the pedestrian zone that we now all know and use. So the international community can also be part of Brussels' future. Are you going to be part of Brussels' future and make history? So we need to know our history, number one. Number two, we need to know our numbers, because there is power in numbers. Internationals are 1/3 of all potential voters in these local elections, and they actually represent half of all potential voters in communes like Etterbeek, Ixelles, and Saint-Gilles. And so you have to ask yourself, who are elections really for? Do you recognize this man? Who is he? Well, this is Philippe Close, mayor of Brussels 1000. Do you know how many votes Philippe Close received in the 2018 local elections? He was the top vote getter. He received the most votes of anybody in the local elections. 8,501 votes. Now, how many internationals in Brussels 1000 were signed up to vote in 2018? Only 16% of internationals, so 7,254 votes. But if they had all signed up to vote, do you know what percent of the vote they would have had? 35% of all voters, or 44,481 votes. So who has the power in the local elections? You do, we do, as ordinary citizens. Now, these statistics are very similar across all 19 Brussels communes. For example, here are the results for Ixelles, where internationals could have been 46% of local voters, or 31,000 votes. Again, the democratic deficit in Brussels means that it's so much easier to get elected as a politician with maybe a few hundred votes for a seat in the city council. And even the top vote getters, mayors, often only receive a few thousand. Whereas if everyone votes, then these elections are going to be so much more responsive to the ordinary needs of citizens like you and me, and we're all going to get one step closer to the commune that we want on the issues that we all care about for the future of Brussels. This is going to be so important in these 2024 elections that are close and competitive in the Brussels region. The polls are constantly changing, suggesting that there could be a big change in the coalitions that not only run the Brussels region, but also your commune, which could mean major changes in your commune. So for that, you need to know what are your priorities in these 2018 elections. And luckily, Belgium offers us electoral tests that have been developed by the major Belgian public broadcasters and universities. In Dutch, you have the STEM test by the VRT, and the French version is called the Test Electoral by the RTBF and La Libre. All of these give you a general test, but also a specific test for Brussels. So you can see how the national parties position themselves on the key issues for the Brussels region. And a lot of those are similar to the issues in your commune. So we need to know our priorities and also our contributions in these elections, because EU citizens, non-EU citizens, I mean, they're not only transforming the Brussels economy and culture, but also politics. For example, in the 2018 local elections, 300 EU citizens ran, and 25 were actually elected in half of the 19 communes and across the political spectrum. Plus, Brussels now has mayors that are representing the diversity of the city.